Hi, my name's Paul Grogan and welcome to the first in a series of videos where I'm going to be showing you how to play Endless Winter. In this video I'm going to be teaching you how to play the base game. The other videos in the series are all going to be playthrough videos if you want to see how the game plays out. Second video is going to be covering the base game and all of the other videos are going to be covering each of the expansions one at a time. A big thank you to Fantasia Games for sponsoring this video. If you found this video useful and you enjoyed it, please obviously give me a like and leave me a comment on the video, but I do rely on the financial support of my Patreon campaign in order to keep the channel going. So if you are in a position to be able to support me on Patreon, your support is very much appreciated. So let's have a look at what we've done. As you can see, I've already set some of the things up for you. We've got the main game board here, we've got the animal board here, we've got the idle track here, we have the Megalith board here, we've got the map, which I haven't built yet. We've got some culture cards down here, and we've got one of the player boards here. I'm going to be setting up a 3-player game today, but I'm just going to show you my player board. Imagine that there are 2 other players sat at the table as well. And a quick note before we start, I'm actually using the deluxe version of the game. So if you don't have the deluxe version of the game, some of the components you see here might be different. Well, they will be different if you've only got the standard version of the game. But don't worry, the game functions exactly the same. It's just the deluxe version. The pieces are slightly nicer. Okay, so let's head on over to the main board and let's see what we've got. Now, the game is divided into 4 rounds, which are tracked by this marker here. So we have round 1, then we have an eclipse phase, then round 2, another eclipse phase, 3 eclipse phase, 4 an eclipse phase, and then the game is over. You'll also notice this era 2 here. So the game starts off in era 1, which covers the first 2 rounds of the game, and then it switches to era 2 for the second 2 rounds of the game. The player with the most victory points is the winner at the end, and you track your victory points around the outside of the board using these markers here. Once you've gone all the way around the board, if you get back to 100, you flip your marker over to the other side, and then you carry on counting. Each player will have a player marker in this area of the board. This will determine the turn order for the start of the game, and we'll get back to that later on. And then below the board, we have the tribe cards. So what we have is we have 5 decks of tribe cards, and each of the cards in each of these decks, so these decks are 15 cards each, and each card within this deck is identical. So these are all crafters, for example. Now, where you place these cards is dependent on the icon on the card. So this card has the flame icon, which means it goes here. So yeah, we've got 5 different decks of tribe cards. We're going to be getting those cards, and we're going to be adding them to our decks. While we're talking about the tribe cards, I just want to mention this here. Every single tribe card has a number 1 on a dark background on the left-hand side of the card. This is end-of-game victory points. So at the end of the game, for each of these cards that you have, whether it's in your hand, your deck, your discard pile, wherever it is, you're going to get the points for it. So that is the icon for end-of-game victory points. While we're on the main board, I'm actually going to set up the sacred stone tiles. So we have spaces here to put the sacred stone tiles. Sacred stone tiles are divided into era 1 and era 2. There are 10 of each. And what we do is we give these a bit of a shuffle and we're going to lay them out. Now, in a 4-player game, we would fill all of the spaces. In a 3-player game, we will not fill this space here. And in a 2-player game, we would only deal 4 tiles to these spaces. We're going to be setting up for a 3-player game, so I'm going to be placing these tiles here. Now, these sacred stone tiles, you'll notice, have victory points printed on them, but the victory points that's printed on them is actually on a light background and not a dark background. What that means is they are points that you will score during the game rather than at the end of the game. We'll come on to these in a little bit more detail later on, but we've got 6 Era 1 Sacred Stone tiles for a 3-player game. The rest of these tiles we do not need. Then what we do is we shuffle the ones for Era 2, and we lay these out as well. Now, you cannot buy these Era 2 tiles until we get to Era 2, but it can be important if you are formulating a strategy to see what type of cards, what type of tiles are available. So there we go, that's those. Then over to the right hand side we have the animal board. We have an animal deck which contains a whole bunch of different types of animals. We're going to be laying them out onto here just before the game starts. And then below the board we have space for the culture cards. So the culture cards have the same backs as the tribe cards, but you can identify them as culture cards because in the top left-hand corner they have an animal skin with a number which is either 1 or 2. So I've got all of the Era 1 cards here, and I've got all of the Era 2 cards here. So we're going to shuffle the Era 2 cards, we're going to place them here, and we put this cap card on top just as a reminder that we're not using this deck until we get to Era 2. Then we take the Era 1 cards, we give them a shuffle, and we're going to lay out 8 of them. So there are 8 culture cards available at the start of the game. These all have all sorts of different icons on. There's a lot of icons in this game, and the first time you play it, you are going to have to learn what the icons do. They're all covered on the back of the rulebook, and I'm not going to go through every single one in this video, but you will notice that most of these cards have a victory point value printed on them. Again, that is end of game victory points if you own that card at the end of the game. So there we go, we've got 8 culture cards. Next is the idle track and the Megalith board. Now the idle track is really simple. You just place the idle board here. There's actually 2 tracks on this, and each player starts with one of their idle markers at the bottom. So we have the offering track up here, we have the honor track over here. We're going to be moving those idle markers up as the game goes on, which is going to get us benefits during the game, but also benefits at the end of the game. The Megalith board is here, and you have various options for building the Megalith board, which are all shown in the rulebook. Let me just show you here. So the game says that you should build any one of these 15 patterns, but it is recommended that you use the one for the number of players. So if we're setting up for a 3-player game, we can use any of those patterns here. As I said, you can use any of them if you want to, if you want it a bit different, but for your first few games, I'd definitely recommend using the ones based on the player count. So I've chosen this one here, and that is how I've laid the map out. Now you'll notice the Megalith board is made up of 4 individual Megalith tiles, which are not the same. So you basically place them at random. Over to the map. Okay, so the map consists of the base terrain tile. This is the base terrain tile. That always goes in the middle. You then have land terrain tiles, which are these, and you have glacier tiles, which are these. So to set up the map, I'm going to go through the setup steps now. What you do is you place the base terrain tile in the middle of the board like that. Then you take out 1 tile of each of the 6 terrain types. So that's 1 of each. And you put them to one side. Then to that stack of 6 tiles, you add in a number of glacier tiles, depending on the number of players in the game. If it's a 4-player game, you will add in 3 glaciers. If it's a 2 or 3-player game, you add in all 6 glaciers. So there we go. So we've now got 12 tiles in this stack. From the rest of the land terrain tiles, we give them a shuffle, and then we add a number of these tiles to this stack to make it up to 18. We need 18 tiles for the game, so we're going to add, because we've got 12 in a 3-player game, I'm going to add in another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There you go. Right, they are the tiles that we're going to use for this game. Then what you do is you give them a good shuffle, and then what you do is you lay them out around this to make a hexagonal grid. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to line them up so that all the icons are facing me, because I'm very selfish. So what you're going to be doing during the game is you're going to be placing camps. All the camps will start on the base terrain tile, but you'll then be moving those camps around the board from one hex to another. In the Eclipse phase, and you'll notice all of these tiles, apart from the glacier, all of these tiles have the Eclipse icon on. What that means is in the Eclipse phase, whoever has the most influence over a tile is going to get the benefit of that tile. So there is a bit of an area control mechanism in play here, with players moving camps and also building villages to have the most influence over these tiles. I need to move my tribespeople. Depending on which tiles come out will potentially affect the way that you play the game. Right, let's look at the player board. So each player has their own player board. I've already put all of the pieces on this, but each player starts with one of these like clear blue cubes that tracks how much food you've got, and another one that tracks how many tools you've got. Now you put those at 0 at the start of the game. The amount of food that you have is limited by the number of camps that you have placed on the board. So at the start of the game, you can see that I can only store 5 food, but as soon as I start building camps, I can then store more food. So these are camps. As I mentioned, you're going to be placing these onto the map, and in fact, at the start of the game, every player takes their leftmost camp and places it on the base terrain tile. So let me just get one for the other 2 players in the game. So yeah, we're playing a 3-player game today with purple, green and red, and we all start off with a camp on the base terrain tile. So I can actually store 6 food at the start of the game. Below that you have your villages. We'll come on to how you build your villages later on. In each of these piles there are 2 megaliths. So the leftmost ones are the grey ones. These are neutral, these are not yours, but these are the ones that you must build first. And then each of these other stacks has 2 megaliths of your own colour. You're going to be building these from left to right when you place them on your board. There is a space for your sacred stone tiles here. So when you take a sacred stone, you will place it here. Your second one will go here. Your third one will go here. And again, have a look. We've got an eclipse icon there and here. That means in the eclipse phase, you're going to get the benefits of all of these things that you have unlocked or placed on your board. Now, this is a deck building game, and each player starts the game with a deck of cards. Everybody starts the game with the same 9 cards, which have got your tribe symbol on there and are colour coded. So I'm the purple player, so these are all my cards. You've got 1 tribeswoman, 1 brave, 1 communal feasts, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tribesmen and an altars. They are your 9 starting cards. They will be your starting deck, although you will get some of those cards in your hand at the start of the game. Quick note about how the flow of the game works. What's going to happen is you're going to have a hand of cards, and on your turn, when you play cards, you're going to be playing them above your player board. So you'll play them above your player board, and they will do various things. The tribesman doesn't do very much, but communal feast, for example, does do something. Once you've played your cards, at the end of your turn, they will go into your discard pile, which is placed to the right of your board. As in most deck building games, when your deck is empty, if you then need to draw a card, and only at the point you need to draw a card, you will take your discard pile, you will shuffle it, you will make a new deck, and you will carry on drawing cards. So that's the cycle of the cards. You will draw them from your deck into your hand, you will play them above your player board, at the end of your turn they'll go to your discard pile, and then when you need to draw a card and you can't, your discard pile shuffles and becomes a new draw pile. Below your playboard you have 2 areas. You have an area here which is where you're going to be keeping your animals. There's a little icon there, so that's where you're going to be keeping your animals, and this is your burial cap card. So during the game you will have the opportunity to bury cards. When you bury a card, it can come from either your hand, your played area, or your discard pile, and you can take the card and you put it under the buried pile. Cards in the buried pile will give you benefits at the end of the game, which we'll come on to later on. But that's essentially how the player board works. Now you've also got these. So you've got 3 workers in the game. You have 2 of these normal workers, these tribespeople, but you've also got a plastic base which will be used for your chief. So let's go through the chief cards now. There are 5 chief cards included in the base game. And what you do is you shuffle these cards at the start of the game and each player will get 1 of them. There is a variant in the rulebook if you wanted to do a drafting version, but for this video I'm just going to shuffle the cards and each player is going to get 1 of them. So I'm going to get Chief Tuskbreaker. Now what I like to do is I like to place that to the left of my player board because this card is not a normal card. This card will not go in your deck. It will never be shuffled or go into your hand or anything like that. It is the representation of your chief's special ability. The card is actually 2-sided, and before every game starts, once you've done all of the other setup, each player will choose which of the side of their card they want to use. And the ability, I'm not going to go through all of the abilities in this video, but essentially on the turn when you place your chief, you will get to use the ability on the card. Speaking of your chief, let's get the chief. So I've got Chief Tuskbreaker, so I'm going to take the figure that matches Chief Tuskbreaker, which is this one, and what you do is you slot that into there. So there you go. There's my 3 workers. I've got my 2 normal workers, and I've got my chief, and that is that setup done. Right, what else do we need to do before the game starts? We need to determine starting order and everybody's starting cards. So in addition to everybody getting a random chief card, there are these 5 setup cards, and these get shuffled at the start of the game, and everybody will get 1 of them. Again, there is a drafting variant where you could choose these in reverse player order, but for now, I'm just going to say I get this card. Now, this card determines how many tools that I start with. So I start with 2 tools, how much food I start with, which is 4 food. Notice the icon here. So this icon tells me which of the tribe cards I'm going to start with. And this icon tells me which of the animals I'm going to start with. So if we just have a look back at the tribe cards, the card I've started with is the one which has got this icon on. So I start with an elder. So at the start of the game, I have one of these cards which is actually included in my deck at the start of the game. The next thing to do is to have a look at the animal. So I've got this icon here, which is the blue one with like 3 claw marks. So what we do is we go through the animal deck and we just have a look until we get to, it's that one, it's the ground sloth. So I start the game with a ground sloth. So what I do is I take the ground sloth and I place it below my player board. You can see there, that was the icon of the ground sloth, and that is the icon on the card. So I've hunted that. I've not killed it yet. I'm keeping it, safe and well, because the animals are a set collection method. So at the end of the game, you're going to score points for collecting animals of the same type together. There is a tip ability on the card. When you tip the animal, you'll get the benefit on it, which kind of represents your slaughtering it. The ground sloth, for example, when you tip it, gets you 1 tool and 4 food. But if you tip it you keep it sideways, and then it does not count for the set collection at the end of the game. So your animals effectively are ones where you hunt them to collect them, and then you can either tip them to get the benefit, or you can keep them for points at the end of the game. So that's everything on my setup card. Everybody will do that, but there was one thing I wanted to mention, because one of these cards is special. One of these cards, this one, has this icon on. And what that means is if you get this setup card, you start with an extra camp on the base terrain tile. Okay, that's that done. So what else do we need to do? The animals, once you've done that, we can do the animal board now actually. So once all players have got their animal from their setup card, you will shuffle the animals and you will place them on here, and then we are going to fill the hunting grounds. Now this is filled with one more card than the number of players. So we're a 3-player game today, which means we need 4 cards. So that's the hunting grounds created. The final bit of setup is these cards. There's 4 of these cards included in the game, 1, 2, 3 and 4. You only use the ones based on your player count. So we're going to be setting up a 3-player game today, so we don't need card number 4. These get shuffled and 1 goes to each player. So I'm going to have this one, which is number 2. Let's say, so that's my card. Let's say the red player gets number 1, and let's say the green player gets number 3. So the first thing we do is turn order. The red player is number 1, so they go to the top. I'm number 2, so I go there, and green is 3rd. So that's the turn order decided for the first round of the game. The next thing we do is we get all of the additional benefits printed on the card. So my benefit is 1 additional food. So because I'm the second player, I start the game with 1 extra food. And also printed on the card is your starting hand. So I mentioned that you have your deck of cards, but you're going to start with some of them in your hand at the start of the game. That starting hand is the same for every player. It is the tribe card that you got from setup. So that starts in your hand. Your brave card, your tribeswoman card, and then 2 random cards. So what you do is you shuffle your deck, get 2 cards at random, and then place the rest of your deck onto the left-hand side of your board. So there's my 5 cards that I start the game with, and the other 5 cards are in my deck. Now the starting this card, on the reverse side of this card is a summary of the action phase, the eclipse phase, and final scoring. So it's recommended that you keep this, just pop it down to one side, because there is a lot of useful information on it. There is also printed here a list of the lesser benefits in the game, but those lesser benefits I'll mention later on in the video. They are also printed on there as well. Right, I think that is the setup done. So let's talk about how you play the game. So as I mentioned at the start, the game is played over 4 rounds. Each round consists of an action phase where the players will take turns performing actions. Then you have an eclipse phase. At the end of the eclipse phase, there is a little bit of preparation before you move to the next round. In the action phase, what's going to happen is in turn order, each player will take their first turn. Then each player will take their second turn, and then each player will take their third turn. So each player gets 3 turns per round of the game. The reason why you get 3 turns is because you've got 3 workers. And in each of your turns, you are going to be placing one of these workers to perform actions. After you have placed your 3rd worker and performed your 3rd turn, you have to create your eclipse pile. So that is actually an additional step that you do on your turn after you've had your 3rd turn. So, for example, it is player 1, first turn, player 2, first turn, player 3, first turn. Then everybody takes their second turn, then red takes their 3rd turn, and then immediately at the end of red's 3rd turn, they must create their eclipse pile. Then purple takes their 3rd turn and they create their eclipse pile, and then green takes their 3rd turn and then they create their eclipse pile. So the eclipse piles are created at the end of your 3rd turn. We'll come on to more details why that's important later on, but essentially you have to declare how many cards you're putting in your eclipse pile, and that might influence what the later players do. Once everybody has done that, we move to the eclipse phase, and all of the cards that you've played in your eclipse pile will be revealed, and then you get to do all of the abilities on them. The important thing to note is the 5 cards that you start the game with in your hand, they are your 5 cards not for your first turn, they are your 5 cards for the first round. You are only going to get to draw, I mean there are certain ways in the game you can draw cards, but the overall main game way of drawing cards is between the eclipse phase and the next round, in what's called the preparation phase, you draw 5 new cards from your deck. So if you use all of your 5 cards in the first turn of the game and don't have a way of getting any more, You can still play your second and third turns, but you won't be able to play any cards. So be very careful about playing too many cards too early. Let's talk about what you do in your action phase. And as I mentioned, this is actually summarized on this player card here. So the first thing that you do on your turn is you play culture cards. Culture cards, as we mentioned earlier, have I started with any? I haven't started with any at the start of this game, but let's just say, for example, that I actually started with that card in hand instead of that one. There we go. Right, so, oh look, I've got a culture card. So culture cards must be played as the first thing on your turn. And what you do is you take the card, you play it above your player board, and you get to resolve the ability that's printed on the card. It's fairly simple. This one is spend 1 tool to build a Megalith. As I say, I'm not going to go through all of the cards, I'm not going to go through all of the icons, but this is a card that all players start with, and it allows you to spend 1 tool to build 1 Megalith. Now your first culture card that you play on the turn is free. You play it, and you do what it says on the card. If you wanted to play any other culture cards on the same turn, you can, but you must discard 1 card for every other culture card that you play on that turn. So if you're sat there with a hand of 3 culture cards, you could play them all in the first turn, but it would cost you extra cards. Or what you could do is play 1 of them in turn 1, 1 of them in turn 2, and then 1 of them in turn 3, and then you wouldn't have to pay any extras. So yeah, culture cards at the start of the game, players are only going to be playing 1 a turn, but as you collect more culture cards during the game, you are going to be in a position, if you've bought lots of culture cards, where you have more than 1 in hand. Just remember, you can play more than 1 of them at the start of your turn, but you have to discard a card for every card you play beyond the first. That's the first step that you do in your turn, is playing culture cards. Once you've finished playing culture cards, you go into the next step of your turn, and you can no longer play culture cards. Even if you now pick one up, you cannot play it until the start of your next turn. The cards, however, that you have played stay above your player board. So let's go through the next step. You take one of your workers, and you can place any one of them, and you go to one of the 4 action columns on the main game board, or you can rest by placing it on your own player board. So there are 5 possible locations that one of your workers can be placed, either of the 4 action columns on there, or the rest action on here. Let's go through the 4 action columns, and before I explain the details, I'll just explain how each of them works, because each one has 3 sections. It has a white section at the top, then it has a shaded section here, and then it has a bonus space here. So what happens when you choose an action, you place your worker in the top section. You may then perform this action as many times as you want to. Notice the infinity symbol here means you can do this as many times as you want to. If you go here, you could have done this as many times as you want to. If you go here, there's actually 2 different actions, and you can do these 2 actions in any order as many times as you want to. So you could do this action once, then this action twice, then this one once, then that one again, etc., etc. So whichever column you choose, you can perform the action in the white section as many times as you want to. Now you'll notice an icon here, which is the hand. The hand represents labour. And we haven't covered labour yet, but to get labour, what you need to do is you need to play cards from your hand. We'll come on to that later on. Once you've done this as many times as you want, you then move your worker to the next space, and you may do this once only. It is optional, you don't have to do it, but it is there if you want to. Once you've done that, you move your worker to the bottom space, and you get the bonus of the space that you covered over. But that only applies to the first player to choose that action column each round, because once you go onto the bonus space, you've covered the space up. So if another player comes along later on, or even me, I could do the same action again if I wanted to. They would again place their worker there, they'd do this as many times as they want, then they'd move to here, they'd do this once, but then they'd move their worker down here. They don't get to use the bonus because it's already been taken. So they are the 4 action columns and how each of the 4 work. I'll go through them in a little bit more detail later. Your other option, and don't forget this because it can be very important, is you can rest. If you rest, you just place your worker here, and when you rest, you do these 2 things here, which is draw 1 card. So that icon is the icon for drawing a card, and this icon is tipping an animal. Now I mentioned tipping animals earlier on, but the most important thing to remember about tipping animals is you cannot just do it whenever you want to do it. You can only do it when you get the option to do it. For example, with this icon here. So if I went here, I rested, I would draw 1 card from my hand, from my deck to my hand. Then I would tip an animal if I wanted to. Also, notice this here. This is every figure that you have resting is going to give you a bonus in the Eclipse phase. So that's pretty much the resting action covered. Let's go through the rest of the actions on the main game board, starting with the initiate action column. And as I'm explaining these actions, I'm going to branch off and talk about other parts of the game as well. So this first action is gaining new tribe cards to your hand. So by default in this game, every time you see an icon for a card, it means take the card and place it straight into your hand, not into your discard pile like many other deck builders. So this is spend 1 tool and 1 labor to take a tribe card. Now, I mentioned that you can do this action as many times as you want to, and that is true, but if you do this action more than once, every tribe card you take must be different, which is what the not equals to sign means. So if I spent 3 tools and generated 3 labor, I could take 3 different tribe cards from here. Those tribe cards will go directly into my hand. Now, there is a slight exception with this action in that any tribe cards I put into my hand, I cannot then use immediately to generate additional labor. And let's talk about generating labor. So to generate labor, what you do is you play cards above your player board. So for example, I could play the tribesman above my player board and it has 1 labor icon on it. What that means is I play it there and I have generated 1 labor. Some of the cards, for example, the tribeswoman, generates 1.5 labor. Now 1.5 labor, as you might expect, is actually 1, unless you get another half from somewhere else. But also, other than the tribesman, every card has 2 abilities printed on it. The bottom ability is the Eclipse ability. That will only apply if you play that card into your Eclipse pile. The top ability is when you play it above your player board. So if I play the tribeswoman, I gain 1.5 labor, and at some point on my turn, I may spend 1 food to gain 1 tool. Completely up to me if I want to do it, but I can do that on my turn. If we also have a look at the Brave card, I could play this for labor. This also generates 1.5 labor, but the Brave's special ability is it generates 1 additional labor when played in the action phase. So actually, the Brave card on his own is 2.5 labor. So if I played these 3 cards, for example, that is actually 1, 2.5, 3.5, 4, 5. That's 5 labor that I've just generated. But remember what I said earlier on, if you spend all of your cards on your first turn, you're not going to have many cards left for your later turns. So what you do is you generate labor and you spend that labor. Now there is one other way of generating labor. If we just have a look at the player boards, you will notice that just above the food track are these labor icons. So you can spend food to gain added labor. Now the way that that works is you move your cube to the left, and if you move your cube so that it crosses over a vertical space that has the labor icon, you will gain 1 labor. So for example, if I've got 5 food at the moment, I could spend 1 food, and that because I've passed that icon, I would gain 1 labor. However, if I had 6 food, then spending 1 food does not actually generate me 1 labor, because if you look, there is no icon there. So if I had 6 food and I wanted to generate 1 labor, I would actually have to spend 2 food to generate that 1 labor. So they are the 2 ways in the game of generating labor, either playing cards above your player board, like so, or by spending food. So we've talked about this action. This is spending tools and labor to take these tribe cards, and they go directly into your hand, which means you could use them to play on future turns, or you can keep them to play in your Eclipse pile. The next action here is spend 1 food to do this and or this. Both of these are optional, and this icon here means a tribe card to your discard pile. So this one was a tribe card to your hand. This one means you take a tribe card and you put it into your discard pile. Now, why do you want to put a card into your discard pile? Well, it becomes part of your deck, so you're going to see that card later on. But also remember, every single one of these cards is worth 1 point at the end of the game. So yeah, so that icon is put a tribe card into the discard pile. And it has to be noted that you can take the same tribe card here as you took here. There is no restriction here on which tribe card you take, but just as a reminder, you only get to do this shaded section once. The other thing on this strip here is burying a card. Now, when you bury a card, as I mentioned earlier on, you can take a card from pretty much anywhere. You can take either one of your played cards, or you can take a card from your discard pile, or you can take a card from your hand. And what you do is you take the card from wherever it is and you put it onto the burial cap card to indicate that you've buried the card. You probably want to try and avoid burying one from your hand because you haven't actually used it yet. Whereas if you bury one of your played cards or one of your discarded cards, then you've already used it, you've already got the benefit of it, and you want to put it in your burial pile. There's two reasons why you want to bury cards. First of all, as anybody who's played deck building games will know, you want to thin your deck as much as possible by getting rid of the bad cards. And if we talk about what is a bad card, well, the Tribesman, unfortunately, sorry about this, Mr. Tribesman, but you're a bad card because all you do is generate one labour. So the sooner you get these cards out of your deck and into the burial pile, you are making your deck better by giving it a higher proportion of good cards in the deck. The second reason why you want to bury cards is end of the game scoring based on the idle track, but we'll come on to that later on. The thing to know, if you do bury a card that is worth points, so for example, if I have the Shaman or the Shaman and I bury it, I still get those points at the end of the game. So there's almost no disadvantage to burying a card, other than you won't see that card again. Back to the board. So that's that bit. So this bonus action here is bury a card, which we've seen already, and idle. So every time you see this icon, this means that you can move one of your idle markers up on either one of the idle tracks. There's two idle tracks, the offering track and the honor track, and all you do is you just simply move your marker up one space. The left-hand side, it kind of doesn't matter where you are because there's no competition for who got there first, but on the honor track, it is important to know who got to a particular height first. So whenever you move up on this side, you always move as far to the left as possible. So let's say red got 2 idle movements. If I then get 2 idle movements, I go 1 and I go 2 to there. Red is still ahead of me on this track. If I get 1 more, I go to there. Now the idle tracks, I might as well talk about this now. The idle tracks have certain benefits printed on the right hand side. You will gain that benefit as soon as your marker reaches that particular row. So here, for example, I would get 2 points. What the left-hand side does is this will determine the value at the end of the game of your tools and your food. So if you haven't advanced up this track, any leftover tools and food you have at the end of the game are not worth any points whatsoever. But if you're in this section, then what you do is your tools and your food are worth, they convert to points on a 4-to-1 ratio. So the higher you go up this track, the more your tools and food are worth at the end of the game. And also, if you're at the top of this track, you can use any further idle movements to just gain 1 immediate point instead. The right-hand track is the honor track, and what this does is it determines the value of the cards in your burial pile at the end of the game. So whoever is the highest on this track, which if the game was to end right now would be purple, uses this box here. You look at how many cards you've got in your burial pile, tells you how many points you've got. So if the game was to end now and I've got 5 cards in my burial pile, I am highest on the track and I get 10 points because I've got 5 cards. Second is red. Second place will use this box here, and the third box is for all other players as long as they've moved up the track. So in this case, green hasn't actually moved up the track whatsoever. So even if green had buried like 20 cards in his burial pile, he's not going to get any points at the end of the game. So just as a reminder, player who is highest on the track uses this box, second highest uses that box, everybody else, as long as they've advanced, uses that box. There you go, we've actually covered end of game scoring for the idle track. But that's what the idle icon does, and that's why you want to move up the idle track. Okay, moving on to the develop action. The first action here is really expensive. It's 3 labour to buy a culture card, but culture cards are very powerful. So what you do is you spend 3 labour and you simply take one of the culture cards from the display of 8 and you put it into your hand. Now remember what I said earlier on, culture cards are played at the start of your turn. So if you use that action to take a culture card, you cannot then play it immediately on the same turn. You'll have to wait to the start of your next turn. Culture cards will not replenish until the end of the round. So the more of these that get purchased, there is fewer choice for anybody else buying culture cards that round. And also remember what I said, you can do this as many times as you want to. So although it is very rare for somebody to be able to generate 6 labour, they generate 6 labour, they could take 2 culture cards. The next action is buying a sacred stone. The cost to buy a sacred stone is always 1 tool, but it is a variable amount of food depending on which sacred stone tile it is that you're buying. Your first sacred stone tile will cost you 1 tool and 1 food. Your second one will cost you 1 tool and 2 food. And your third one will cost you 1 tool and 3 food. You buy the sacred stones from up here, and in rounds 1 and 2, you can only buy from Era 1 tiles. Once the game moves to round 3, you can actually buy any of them. So what you do is, let's say this is the first turn of the game and I decide I want to buy this one. I take the tile and I will slot it into my player board. And there is an immediate benefit for slotting it. This one is bury a card. These are all icons we've seen before. This one is to place a tribe card in my discard pile, and this one is add a tribe card to my hand. So they are immediate benefits for placing the sacred stone tile. Then, once you've placed the sacred stone tile, it's going to score based on the condition printed on the tile in the Eclipse phase. We'll come on to that in a little bit more later on, but just remember that every sacred stone you've got will score you points in the Eclipse phase as long as you meet the conditions printed on the tile itself. So again, talking about variability in the game will be affected, your overall strategy and the choices you make, by potentially which sacred stone tiles are available in the game. The bonus space here is very simple. It is gain 1 tool and 1 food, and we're done. The third action column is Migrate. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 2 possible actions in this area, and you can do these as many times as you want and in any order. That action is spend 1 tool to place a camp on the base terrain tile. You always place new camps on the base terrain tile. So if I spent 2 tools, I would take 2 camps from here and I would place them on the base terrain tile, like so. The next action to explain is this one. This is spend 1 labour to move 1 camp. When you move a camp, it is moved at the start of the game. You will move from there to an adjacent tile, but every time you move a camp, it is 1 camp, 1 space to an adjacent hex. So if I decided to gain 3 movement points, I could move 1 to there, I could move 1 to here, and I could move 1 to here. Remember what I said about the map? What you're trying to do is, in the Eclipse phase, you are trying to have the most or joint most influence over each hex on the map, and if you do, you will get the benefit of that hex. But friendly ties apply here. So if 2 players have the same influence over a hex, then they're both going to get the benefit of the hex in the Eclipse phase. And how do you get influence? Influence is very simple. It is 1 influence per camp. So if we were in an Eclipse phase now, I have influence over this hex, so I'm going to gain 1 point in the Eclipse phase. Both purple and red have influence over this hex, so they're both going to get 1 tool. The next action to explain is this one, and this is 3 food to build a village. But to build a village, you must have 3 camps, and those 3 camps must be on the 3 hexes around a juncture. Now what I mean by that is this, for example. So if I have a camp here, and a camp here, and a camp here, I have 3 camps around this juncture here. And what I can do is I can spend 3 food and convert them into a village. What happens is I place a village there, I take the camps off, and the camps go back to my player board. And that would cost 3 food to do that. Now, why would you want a village on the board? Because it's very expensive and you've removed your camps. Is a village will provide 2 influence to every hex that it is touching. So if we go to the Eclipse phase now, for example, red is not going to get the bonus of this hex because red only has 1 influence on this hex, whereas purple has 2 on this one, and this one. Also notice the glacier tiles. If you're not playing with the additional glacier tokens module, the glacier tiles are not actually worth anything in the Eclipse phase. There could still be a benefit to building on them, depending on what sacred stones are in play. But probably a better place to build that village would have been here, because then in the Eclipse phase, I'm going to get all those 3 bonuses. You can only have 1 village per juncture, and also note that you cannot have a village touching the base terrain tile. That is not allowed. So no villages are allowed touching the base terrain tile. They all have to be outside of that. Finally, the bonus of the Migrate action is place 1 camp and move 1 camp. Again, once you get used to the icons, you get to know what they mean and game flows a lot better. Finally, the hunting action. We have 2 optional actions here. The first one is spend 1 labour to add 2 cards to the hunting ground, up to the maximum limit of 6. So if we were to do that now, we would simply add 2 cards to it. But if there was already another animal there, and we chose to do this action, we would simply just add 1 animal to the hunting grounds. The next action is spend 1 tool and 1 labour to take an animal from the hunting grounds. So you choose which animal you want to. So let's say I spent 2 tools and 2 labour. I could take both of these stag mooses and I would place them below my player board like that. In fact, they're both the same. I would probably stack them up like that. And remember, you are trying to collect sets of animals for end of game scoring points. The next one is tip an animal. And remember what I said, you cannot just tip animals in this game whenever you want to. You can only do so when you get the opportunity to do it, which is here. It is optional, but that is your chance to do it if you want to. And when you tip an animal, as I mentioned earlier, you turn it sideways and you get the tip ability that's printed on it. The ground sloth will give a tool and some food. The stag moose gives a camp and food. Some of them just give food, some of them give lots of tools. All of the animals do different things. The final bonus action here is take one animal, but the question mark means from the top of the deck. So what we do is we just take an animal from the top of the deck, and it's a woolly rhino, and we would add that to our display of animals there. Okay, so that is all 4 of the action columns explained. We've also explained burying cards, we've explained idols, we've explained sacred stones, we've explained camps, we've explained villages, we've explained animals, and I also explained the rest action as well. So I think it's time to move on to placing your chief. In all of the examples so far I have used this worker, but on the turn, when you place your chief, you may use the chief's ability. And in the base game, 4 of the 5 chief cards, this one for example, has that icon on. So basically what that means is, whenever the chief goes hunting, I will gain 1 tool. If I chose the other side of the card, it's whenever the chief goes hunting, I gain 2 food. So in the base game, as I say, 4 of the 5 chief cards actually give you a benefit if your chief performs the action that's printed on the card. Let's talk next about the tribe cards that come with the game. So the 5 tribe cards that come with the game, they are all worth 1 point if you own them at the end of the game, wherever they are. The abilities printed on them, the shaman it's worth 1.5 labour, and if you spend a tool, it's worth an extra 1.5 labour. So if you've got lots of tools, the shaman is really good at generating labour. The elder, the crafter, the pathfinder, and the hunter are all very simple. They give you 1 added labour if you are currently performing the action depicted on the card. So they all work in exactly the same way. That's for their main abilities. The Eclipse abilities are all different, and I'm going to move to the Eclipse abilities now. So, as I mentioned earlier, at the end of your turn, any cards that you've played go to your discard pile, and then if that was your 3rd turn, you must immediately create your Eclipse pile. You create your Eclipse pile with any cards that you have remaining in your hand, which could be none. So if you have no cards in hand, you simply say, I'm not putting any cards into my Eclipse pile. But if you have cards in hand, you can choose how many of them you want to place into your Eclipse pile. You could place all of them, or you might decide to keep some of them in hand. Why do you want to keep some of them in hand? Well, because in the preparation phase before the next round, you're going to draw 5 new cards from your deck into your hand. So you don't draw up to 5, you draw 5 new cards from your deck into your hand, adding them to whatever cards you have left over. So if you decide, if you've got 3 cards in hand and you decide to only play 1 of them into your Eclipse pile, you've got 2 cards left, and in the preparation phase, you'll draw 5 new cards. You will start the next round with 7 cards, which is a big advantage. Once all players have completed their 3rd turn and all players have an Eclipse pile, everybody will then reveal all of the cards in their Eclipse pile. Any culture cards that you've played into your Eclipse pile will immediately come back into your hand. They are used as a kind of bluff to, if you're playing your Eclipse pile first and you say, oh, I've played 6 cards and 3 of them end up being culture cards, then that can bluff the other players into thinking you've got a bigger Eclipse pile. So culture cards played into your Eclipse pile will come back into your hand. The next thing that happens is a bidding for turn order. So bidding for turn order is based on the amount of labour, total labour of all of the cards that everybody has played into their Eclipse pile, but only the labour printed in the top left of the card. So the Brave, for example, he was 2.5 labour if played during the action phase, but if played in the Eclipse pile to bid for turn order, he's only worth 1.5. So you add up the total amount of labour that all players have bid, and remember, every figure that you have resting gives you an extra 1.5 labour for the Eclipse phase for the purposes of bidding for turn order. So in this case, if I decided to rest and I played these 2 cards into my Eclipse pile, I would have 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, 4. I'd have 4 labour as my bid for turn order. What you then do is you adjust these turn order markers based on the bid. So if I bid 4 and 4 was the most, I would become the new first player. Let's say, for example, red and green both bid 1. What would happen is their relative positions would swap over. So if you bid the same as somebody else, you actually swap positions with them. So the labour that you play in the Eclipse pile determines your bid, which determines your player order for the next round. Then what happens in the Eclipse phase, each player in order, in the new turn order, resolves 4 rewards. Now it's very important that each player does this individually, one at a time, and it's also important that you resolve these 4 steps in order. The first step is the benefit according to your new position in turn order. So this is Megalith. We haven't mentioned Megaliths yet. I'm going to come on to them later. This is drawing a card. This is gaining an idol. This is gaining a food. This space here, I get questions about this quite often because people say, well, it's only a 4-player game. Why is there a 5th space? The reason why these 5 icons are here is for something to do with lesser benefits that I will explain near the end of the video. So the first reward that you do is the reward according to your turn order. The second rewards that you do is the Eclipse ability of all of the cards that you've played. So if I played these 2 cards into my Eclipse pile, I would get to do this ability here, and I would get to do this ability here. That's step 2. Step 3 is the map. So during step 3, you look at the map, you work out which hexes you have the most or joint most influence over, and you gain the benefits of those hexes. And then finally, step 4 is your player board. At this point, let's say I had that Sacred Stone tile. At this point, you would gain the benefits of all of the Sacred Stone tiles that you've got. You would draw 1 card for each village that you have on the board. You can see underneath the villages there's an icon of a card. If you have the first 2 Megaliths out, you will gain 1 tool. You can actually see what's underneath the space just above it as a little icon. So yeah, so they are the 4 rewards that you do in the Eclipse phase. You've got your reward based on turn order, you've got the reward for all of your cards that you played, you've got the reward for the terrain benefits, and then you've got your Sacred Stones, your villages, and your Megaliths. Once everybody has done that, you then discard all of the cards played into the Eclipse phase onto there, and then we do the preparation phase, which is setting up for the next round. In the preparation phase, all players take that back their workers. We replenish the culture cards, so any empty slots in the culture display will be refilled with cards from the Era 1 deck. When we move from round 2 to round 3, we actually clear all of the culture cards and we use ones from the Era 2 deck instead. And then at the end of round 3, we replenish with cards from the Era 2 deck. What you do is you move that cap card from there to there so that you know which deck to draw from. In the preparation phase, we also replenish the animal display up to 1 more than the number of players. So again, if we were a 3-player game, if this was the preparation phase, we would add 2 more animals into the hunting ground. And then each player draws 5 cards from their deck. So that's the last step that you do in the preparation phase, is you will draw 5 cards from your deck into your hand. We've just got a few rules left before that's everything, and one of them is the Megalith board. Now the Megalith board is one of my favourite parts of the game. As I mentioned in setup, we lay this out in a random fashion, and every time you get the ability to place a Megalith, what you do is you take the leftmost Megalith from your player board. So it has to be, this is the first one that you place, and then you place it somewhere on the Megalith board. Now, there are 3 potential placements for every Megalith that you place. The first option is you may place it on one of the starting spaces. The starting spaces are these 4 grey spaces here. Your second option is that you may place it adjacent, orthogonally adjacent, to any existing tile. Now that can't be done at the start of the game because there's no tiles on the board. So the first one you place will have to be on a starting space. Your third option is only when there is a group of 4 tiles together, you can place an extra one on top of those 4 tiles. So let's go through placing on the board to start with, because that's the first thing you're going to do in the game. Let's say I'm placing a Megalith. It has to be my grey one because that's the one on the leftmost part of my player board. And because there are no tiles on the board so far, I have to place it on one of the starting spaces. So let's say I'm going to place it on this space here. every time you place a Megalith onto the board itself, you gain the benefit of that space. Now, a lot of these icons we've already seen. The only one we haven't seen is this icon here. Now, what this icon means is, whenever I place a Megalith on this space, I immediately place another Megalith. But the second Megalith has to be, see the red arrows? Has to be on an orthogonally adjacent space. So, if I get the ability to place a Megalith and I put it there, then what I do is I take my next Megalith and I could put it here or here, and that would get me 2 food. Once those Megaliths are on the board, let's say another player comes along and decides to place their first Megalith. It has to be a grey one because it's their first one. It could go on a starting space, but it doesn't have to. Because we already have Megaliths on the board, they could choose to place adjacent to an existing Megalith. And instead of getting the bonus of the starting space, they'd get that bonus instead, which is drawing 2 cards. So that is always an option. You can always place adjacent to an existing one. Now, just a clarification about the grey tiles. The grey tiles do not have to be placed on a starting space, but they are the only tiles that are allowed to be placed on a starting space. So you cannot put one of your own coloured tiles onto a starting space. That's not allowed. It has to be on a starting space, but the grey tiles can actually go anywhere. So if you place a tile on the Megalith board on the ground level, you will get the bonus of the space. If, however, let's say we've got a set of 4 here, like this, you decide that you want to place it on top of those 4, which you can only do if there is a group of 4 together, then you will gain points, and you will gain those points immediately. And those points are equal to 2 for each of your tiles that you cover, and 1 for every other tile, which could be belonging to another player, or it could be a neutral one. Remember, your grey tiles are not actually your tiles. Although you're placing them on the board, once they're placed on the board, they're no longer yours. So if I was to put that there, that would actually score me 5 points, 2 for my own, and 1 for each of the grey ones, and they would be immediate points that I would score at that moment. It can happen, and I've not seen it, that you could end up with a third layer as well, but that works in exactly the same way. You score points for the 4 tiles that you're placing on top of, not any of the ones below it. Okay, that's the Megalith board explained. You can get a lot of benefits from there by placing Megaliths, both points for placing on top, but also points for that. But getting Megaliths is actually quite hard. There is none of the 4 actions in the game that allow you to gain Megaliths. So Megaliths are only gained through being first in turn order, or the culture card that every player starts with, the altars card, and various other means as well. But there is no way to build a Megalith with one of the 4 main actions in the game. Okay, what else do I need to cover? Lesser benefits. Now, I've left lesser benefits until the end of the video, and the reason why I've done that is it's actually a very important rule, and when I'm teaching this game in person, if I mention lesser benefits at the start, people have forgotten it by the end. So I'm going to mention the lesser benefits now. The lesser benefits are printed on the bottom of this little player aid here, but they are also here. This list of 5 things is the order of the lesser benefits. And a lesser benefit is actually very simple. It is whenever you are gaining any one of these 4 benefits, you can choose at the instant you're gaining that benefit not to gain the benefit and gain a lesser benefit instead. So for example, if I get the opportunity to draw a card and I decided I don't really want to draw a card, but I really would like an idle movement, then I can take an idle movement instead. Or if I really wanted a tool, I could take a tool instead. This is also important. Whenever you gain tools, if you are at the maximum of your tool limit, then you can always gain a food instead, because the food is the bottom of this chain here. So it's Megalith, drawing a card, gaining an idol, gaining a tool, and gaining a food. And you can always take a lesser benefit. But this only applies at the instant you are gaining that benefit. There is one very small exception to this situation here. I said lesser benefits can be used at any time in the game, and that is true except for one particular time, and that is in the preparation phase where you draw 5 new cards. At that point, the 5 cards that you draw has to be draw 5 cards. You cannot choose a lesser benefit in that particular instance there. And that is everything. That is how you play the base game of Endless Winter. Now, there are 2 modules included in the base game, the resting tokens and the glacier tokens. I'm not going to cover them in this video. I've also not covered the sacred stones in this video in detail, but I'm just going to mention a couple of them. a lot of the Era 1 Sacred Stones will give you points for each village that you have which touches at least one of the indicated types of terrain. So for example, the Sacred Stone which I built here will give me 2 points for each of my villages which is adjacent to a glacier. What that means is if I was to build this here, where it's touching 2 glaciers, it's still just 2 points, because it's for each of my villages which is next to a glacier, not for each glacier that I'm next to. And you will find that a lot of the Era 1 Sacred Stones are all about village placement. The Era 2 tiles, there's lots of these available as well, but a lot of these relate to tipped animals. So you'll see the animal icon on these Sacred Stones, and it's turned sideways. And like I said earlier on, when these tiles get dealt out at the start of the game, you may decide, oh, I'm actually going to adjust my strategy because of that. Because this one, for example, is going to give me points every Eclipse phase for each of this type of animal which I have tipped. So as I mentioned earlier on, when you tip an animal, you do not get the end of game points for it, but it could be useful for some Sacred Stones. The last thing to mention is final scoring. So final scoring is the offering track, which we'd mentioned earlier on, but this is done at the end of the game. You work out how many tools and food you've got, divide them by the ratio depending on the position of your idle marker, and that's how many points you get. So if red was here, they would add up their total number of tools and food, and they would get 1 point for every 3. We then do the honour track, which as I mentioned earlier on, is based on how far you are up the track. That tells you which of these boxes you use, and then you count the number of cards in your burial pile, and you look up how many points you get for that. And as a reminder, cards in your burial pile are still worth the points printed on them as well, which is the third step. So once you've done the offering track and the honour track, you then collect all of your cards together. Cards from your deck, cards from your discard pile, cards from your hand, cards from your burial pile. Every single card that you've collected during the game, except for your animals, you collect up and you look through them, and you go through the points printed on them. So the points for a card is printed on the left-hand side of the card, and you add those points onto your score. And then non-tipped animals. So yeah, the final bit of scoring is sets of animals. So these 2 stag moose, if I kept them, then because I've got 2 of them, they're actually worth 3 points at the end of the game. And the woolly rhino, I've only got 1 of them, that's worth 1 point at the end of the game. The ground sloth, unfortunately, he was tipped, so he's not worth any points at the end of the game. I am just going to dig out the Argentavis, which is this one here. So the Argentavis is a wild animal. At the end of the game, you decide what colour the Argentavis is. So in this particular situation here, I would probably say the Argentavis is a stag moose. So what happens is I would put it on there, and that means I've actually got 3 of them, and I would get 6 points at the end of the game instead of 3. And that's final scoring. The offering track, the honour track, cards that you've collected, and your untipped animals. The player with the most points is declared the winner. And that is everything. That is a full tutorial video. Now this is quite long, but I did go into a lot of detail, and hopefully this has taught you all of the rules for how you play Endless Winter. As I mentioned earlier on, there's a lot of icons in the game, so I would definitely have the back page of the rulebook handy when you're first playing the game, because every icon in the game is explained on here. But once you are halfway through your first game, you'll start to pick up what a lot of the icons mean, and the game will flow a lot better, certainly after your first game. But that's it. I hope you found this video useful, and as I mentioned at the start, please give me a like and leave me a comment on the video if you did find it useful. And thank you very much again to Fantasia Games for sponsoring this video, and a big thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Without you, the channel is not possible. So if you are in a position to be able to support me on Patreon, I would very much appreciate it at patreon.com/gamingrules. And if you want to see a playthrough of the game, then check out the description of the video. I will have links to playthroughs of the base game and a game with each of the expansions. There's going to be a lot of videos in this series. Until next time, take care, and thanks for watching.